Luis Montalvo was 47 years old, his face tanned by the sun and years of road travel. He drove a red Kenworth that was more home than vehicle, littered with empty coffee cans, fast food wrappers, and a black Bible that had belonged to his father. He had no close family, beyond an ailing mother who no longer recognized him, and a brother who hadn't spoken to him in years. His life was a succession of seasons, curves, and silences. Every time he stopped, it seemed harder to start again. There was something broken inside him, though he never paused to identify it, a tiredness that didn't come from his body, a nameless sadness that followed him like a shadow. At night, he spoke to God in a low voice, without waiting for a reply, simply out of habit. That cloudy dawn on Highway 57, something changed. The fine rain was beginning to dirty the windshield when he saw a man standing on the shoulder, dressed in simple clothes, sandals, and with a look that seemed out of this world. Luis braked, almost without thinking. It wasn't usual for him to do so, especially at that hour, but there was something about that face that prevented him from continuing on. The man got in without asking where they were going. "Thank you, Luis," he said, as if he knew him. And he, instead of feeling invaded, felt a strange calm. For miles they spoke little, but every word the stranger said seemed to touch a forgotten corner of his soul. It was as if he knew everything about him, his guilt, his loneliness, even that pain he had never told anyone. Luis didn't understand why, but he handed the wheel to the stranger. He never did. His truck was the only thing he truly felt was his, and yet something inside him wanted to trust him. The man drove smoothly, as if he knew every curve before he reached it. They didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Luis looked out the window and felt something cleanse inside. They passed towns he didn't remember ever seeing, with names that didn't appear on any GPS. Upon reaching one in particular, the man stopped the truck in front of a small white chapel with a crooked bell tower. "This is it," he said simply. Luis got out, almost hypnotized, and as he entered, something broke. He cried without understanding why. He cried for everything he hadn't cried for in years. The man sat in the back pew, silent, while he knelt before a simple altar with a dull wooden cross. If this part shook you, if you felt something stir inside you, subscribe to the channel. Don't let this story get lost. Share it with whoever needs it most. There, in the middle of that unfamiliar chapel, Luis felt for the first time in a long time that he wasn't alone. It wasn't an effusive emotion or a violent revelation, but a gentle, deep certainty, as if an invisible hand had touched his heart. When he turned to speak to the man, he was gone. He ran out to look for him, but there was no sign of him. Not on the sidewalk, not in the street, not in the surrounding fields. Only the sound of the wind through the trees. He returned to the truck, confused, his tears still fresh. As he got in, he noticed something on the passenger seat, a small, hand-carved wooden cross and a note written in blue ink. "You're not lost. You're just coming home." Luis stood motionless, his fingers clutching the paper, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. After that night, Luis was never the same. Every kilometer he traveled had a different meaning. He couldn't explain what had happened, but something inside him had been reorganized. He began to look at the people he met along the way with different eyes. He stopped more often, offered food to strangers, and listened to stories he would have ignored before. One day, he helped a mother fleeing with her baby in her arms, barefoot and trembling on the side of the road. He gave her his jacket, shared what little he had, and drove them to a bus station. On another occasion, he found a migrant lying in the middle of the desert, barely conscious. He gave him water, put him in a truck, and drove 3 hours off his route to take him to a clinic. Luis didn't speak much, but his actions began to shout what his soul had kept quiet for years. At each of those stops, something remained. Sometimes it was a wooden cross he carved himself at night, other times a handwritten prayer or the address of a shelter, and other times he received more than he gave. A boy selling candy gave him a drawing of his truck with an angel at the wheel. An elderly woman touched him on the shoulder and said, "You carry light, son." and a pastor at a small church told him about a man who years before had also picked up Jesus on the road, and from then on dedicated himself to saving lives. Luis began to wonder if he was crazy, if it was all a fantasy, but every time he doubted it, something happened that confirmed it was no coincidence. Each person was a sign, each story a mirror, and his truck, more than ever, was his. Un temple, Luis began to keep a notebook in which he wrote everything down. He wasn't a man of letters, but he felt the need to leave a record. There he wrote the names of the people he helped, what they said to him, what he felt at each encounter. Sometimes he drew, other times he simply wrote dates and places. Maria and her baby near San Luis Potosi. The boy from the desert. God protect him. Boy with candy. He gave me a smile bigger than the road. His journal filled quickly, and with each page, Luis felt his life had a new purpose. No matter how heavy the load or how long the journeys, what sustained him was now invisible. It was as if the wooden cross left by that mysterious man had planted something in his chest, something that grew without stopping. One day, while resting at a roadside inn, a man approached him with a trembling voice. "Are you the one in the red truck?" he asked. Luis nodded, confused. "My sister told me about you. She says you saved her when she was about to give up. She says you were an angel." Luis didn't know what to say. He only listened. The man left him a letter and left without giving any further details. That letter spoke of a woman who, after losing her son, was living aimlessly on the streets. Luis had helped her months before without even knowing her story. He had given her bread, shelter, and a simple piece of advice. God hasn't forgotten you. That sentence, the letter said, was the beginning of his return to life. Luis read it all in silence. His eyes clouded, and as he closed the envelope, he felt smaller than ever. It wasn't him. It had never been him. It was something larger, moving him. After that encounter, Luis understood that every detour on his route had a purpose. He no longer sought to arrive quickly or take the usual shortcuts. If he felt the urge to stop, he did. If he saw someone on the side of the road, he slowed down. His truck no longer carried only goods, it carried hope. He began to carry blankets, bottles of water, bread, small Bibles, and a box with wooden crosses that he carved himself on his nights off. He even had a separate box with empty notebooks for those who wanted to write their own stories. Sometimes at gas stations, he would leave a cross on the windshield of another truck. Other times, he would spend hours talking with someone who needed to vent. Luis didn't lecture. He listened, and that, in many cases, was more than enough. Over time, his name began to circulate among truck drivers, pastors, and families. The one in the red Kenworth, they said. Some looked for him, others simply prayed for him. There were those who didn't believe what they heard about him, but even those, upon meeting his serene gaze at a bus stop, felt something different. Luis didn't seek attention or thanks. Sometimes he didn't even say his name. He just smiled, helped, and continued on his way. One night, a young man who had seen him at a radio station intercepted him to tell him that thanks to his words, he had decided not to take his own life. "I don't know who you are, but you made me feel seen by God," he said with tears in his eyes. Luis hugged him without saying a word. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "Today, the miracle wasn't mine. It was his, as always." And he kept that page with a dried flower that the young man had given him. Has something invisible ever sustained you? If you believe these stories deserve to live on, subscribe now. This channel exists because of people like you. One cold early morning, while crossing a mountainous area near Zacatecas, Luis saw a hunched figure on the side of the road. She was a lonely old woman, dressed in black, with a lost expression. Without hesitation, he stopped the truck and got out, holding a blanket. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, as if she'd been waiting for him. Luis helped her get in and offered her hot coffee from his thermos. They traveled several kilometers in silence. Finally, in a low voice, she whispered, "My son died here 10 years ago." Since then, I've come here every 13th of the month in case he comes back." Luis felt a lump in his throat. He didn't ask any more questions. When they reached a small makeshift shrine with candles and photographs, they stopped. The woman got out, placed a flower, and without looking back said, "Thank you for giving me back my way." Then she disappeared into the mist. Luis stood there for a while, looking at that old photo of a smiling young man. He felt that in some way he too had come home. That day left a profound mark on him. He understood that sometimes he was merely a means, a vehicle for others to close their cycles, find solace, or simply have someone with whom to share their pain. He began to pray more frequently, not for himself, but for those he encountered. He learned to respect silence, to not have answers, to simply be present. And every time he looked at the carved cross that still hung in the rearview mirror, he remembered the man on Highway 57. He never saw him again, but his presence lived on in every story. Luis began to think that perhaps many had had that encounter without knowing it, that Jesus took different forms to get into the trucks of those who were ready to listen. And he, although he didn't feel worthy, was willing. Over the years, Luis accumulated not only stories, but also signs. One day, he found a letter inside a Bible forgotten at a roadside stop, signed by someone named Ernesto. That man recounted that years before, he had also picked up a stranger on the road. The story was almost identical to his own. He described the man in sandals, the peace he conveyed, the visit to an unknown chapel. At the end, Ernesto said, "From that day on, I no longer carry merchandise. I carry hope." Luis froze. He wasn't the only one. He wasn't alone. There were others like him, perhaps many more, scattered along the country's roads. He wondered how many had experienced that encounter, and how many, like him, had been silently transformed. Feeling that invisible brotherhood gave him the strength to continue. It was no longer a solitary mission. It was part of something greater, woven between roads, tears, and redemption. From then on, he began leaving small signs for other drivers. He posted handwritten messages on light poles. "You are not alone. God still sees you. Your burden is not invisible." He hid crosses at gas stations, left messages inside Bibles he had purposely forgotten, and sometimes just a word on a piece of paper: trust. He didn't seek recognition, but when he received messages back, a note taped to the windshield, an encouraging word on the radio, a knowing glance from another trucker, he knew he was sowing. Faith became a silent network among those who traveled the routes with an open heart. Luis understood that the road, for all its hardships, could also be sacred. Every curve was an opportunity, every stop an altar, and every encounter a chance to remember that miracles were still on the road. One hot afternoon, in a lonely stretch of the Sonoran desert, Luis saw a boy walking alone, a torn backpack slung over his shoulder. He stopped the truck without thinking and ran out. The boy was barely 8 or 9 years old, his lips dry and his eyes scared. "Are you lost?" Luis asked softly. The boy nodded without saying a word. He lifted him into the truck, offered him water, and waited patiently for him to speak. In time, he learned that he had run away from home, fleeing the screams, the fear, a sadness he couldn't name. Luis didn't judge. He took him to a shelter in Hermosillo where he knew a nun who cared for children in difficult situations. Before saying goodbye, the boy gave him a drawing, a red truck with wings flying above the clouds. Luis kept it in his notebook with the date written in a corner. "The day I understood that even the smallest ones also flee from hell." That encounter left a mark on him. He began to pay more attention to the children. Sometimes he saw them selling gum at traffic lights, cleaning windshields, or simply sitting on the sidewalk, staring into space. Whenever he could, he would stop. He spoke to them, asked their names, gave them something more than just a coin: time. One of them, in Monterrey, told him he wanted to be a truck driver like him. Luis gave him one of his small wooden crosses and said, "Then be someone who carries good things." not just boxes. The boy looked at him with shining eyes, as if he had just received a secret, and deep down, that was what Luis felt he was doing, giving away secrets, seeds, words that would once have saved him. Not every day was easy. There were times when Luis felt the weight of tiredness, of loneliness, of the doubts that still haunted him at night. Sometimes he wondered if everything he did had meaning, if he wasn't just an old man clinging to an illusion. There were empty roads, cold seasons, starless nights, but even in those dark moments, he found signs. Once, after a particularly difficult day, he stopped at a gas station and found a phrase written in marker on the wall in the bathroom. "What you do in silence, heaven applauds in secret." He didn't know who had written it or who it was intended for, but that night he slept with a lighter heart. Luis learned that miracles weren't always grand. Sometimes they came in the form of a kind word, a kind look, a coincidence that seemed impossible. On another occasion, while driving through a rainy stretch of road, he came across a convoy of stopped trucks. There had been an accident. One of the drivers, a young man, was trapped in his cab, injured and panicking. Luis immediately got out, crawled through the rain, and managed to get him out with others. While they waited for the ambulance, the young man, soaked and shivering, took Luis's hand and said, "I thought I was going to die alone." Luis didn't respond. He just squeezed Luis's fingers and prayed, silently. That night in his notebook he wrote, "Sometimes faith isn't preached, it's held with the hands." And underneath he glued a small tree leaf that had fallen on his truck in the chaos, as if heaven itself were telling him that even in the storm, someone was with him. As the years passed, Luis noticed that his body no longer responded the same. His knees ached on cold mornings, his eyesight tired more quickly, and the fatigue took longer to go away. But his heart, on the other hand, seemed to grow younger. Every story, every person he met gave him a new reason to keep going. He had stopped counting the kilometers and now counted his blessings. A woman in Veracruz gave him a scapular and said, "You gave me back my faith in people." A mechanic in Sinaloa refused to charge him because, "My father spoke of you as if you were a legend." Luis laughed when he heard these things. He didn't feel special, just someone who had learned to listen. Sometimes he thought about the past and was amazed at how much had changed without planning it. A single encounter, a single dawn, and everything had turned around. One day, he decided to return to the place where it all began, Highway 57. He wanted to find the chapel, even though he didn't have coordinates or remember the exact spot. He only knew his heart would guide him. He spent hours driving, looking for signs, attentive to every curve. And when he was about to give up, he saw a dirt driveway with a wooden sign almost erased. He continued down that road, and there it was, the white, simple chapel with the crooked bell tower, just like in his memory. He got out of the truck, trembling. He went inside and sat on the same bench where he had once cried for the first time in years. This time, he didn't cry. He just closed his eyes and gave thanks. He gave thanks for the journey, for the man who changed his life, for every soul he had encountered, for every miracle. In that silence, he felt a presence. He didn't need to open his eyes. He knew he was there. Before leaving the chapel, Luis left something behind. He took out one of his wooden crosses, the most elaborate he had ever carved, and placed it next to the altar. He didn't say a word. He just left it there as a silent testimony to everything he had experienced. As he left, he felt something inside him close with tenderness, like a letter neatly folded after being read. He returned to the truck and, instead of feeling nostalgia, he felt fulfillment. The road was still there, waiting for him, but no longer as a condemnation, but as an extension of his mission. That night, parked under a clear sky, he wrote in his notebook, "I returned to the beginning, but I am not the same. Today I understand that the journey was never outward." And with that sentence he closed the notebook, not because he had nothing left to write, but because he no longer needed more proof. His life was already the testimony. In the following months, something began to change. not in his faith, which remained steadfast, nor in his desire to serve, which continued to burn, but in his body. Medical checkups confirmed what he already suspected. His heart was weak. The doctor advised him to slow down, perhaps get off the road. Luis listened silently, without arguing. He wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of leaving things undone. So he made a decision. He wasn't going to stop, but he was going to do it differently. He reduced his travels, chose shorter routes, and began visiting the same towns where he had once planted something. He wanted to see what had flourished. With each return, he found something new, a family that now had a small business, a child who had returned to school, a cross of his own hanging on the wall. It was like walking on his own harvest. One of those returns was particularly moving. He returned to the clinic where he had left the dying migrant from the desert. He asked for him without much hope, but the nurse recognized him immediately. "Are you the one in the red truck?" she asked with a smile. Then she led him to a tall, strong-eyed man who worked there as an assistant. It was him. He was alive, healthy, and helping others like him. When he saw Luis, he hugged him tightly. "I have no words," he said. "You saved me when I no longer wanted to be saved." Luis barely responded. Just seeing that miracle standing there was enough for him. They shared a coffee, a few laughs, and before saying goodbye, the man gave him a small medal. "I'm not religious, but you restored my faith in humanity. Keep this as a thank you." Luis accepted it, knowing it wasn't for himself, but for what he represented. He hung it next to the cross in his rearview mirror. Every object in his truck now had a meaning. It was no longer just a cargo vehicle. It was a moving shrine. On the dashboard were photos of children, folded letters, small drawings, scapulars, and even a stone a girl had given him to protect you on the road. Every detail was a reminder of why he kept going. One day, a young woman climbed into the truck crying. She had escaped an abusive relationship, not knowing where to go. Luis didn't ask anything. He offered her water, silence, and miles. When they arrived at a safe station, she got out, took a deep breath, and said, "You are the first man who hasn't asked me for anything in return." Luis was silent for a long time after watching her leave. Sometimes he thought, it's not about changing the world, it's about not hurting it anymore. The impact of his presence on the roads began to spread without him even seeking it. A local radio station did a program dedicated to the good guys on the road and mentioned his story. One host described him as the man who turned his trailer into a mobile chapel. Luis found out by chance when another truck driver told him, "They're talking about you on the radio." At first he felt uncomfortable. He didn't want fame, he didn't want attention. But then he understood that perhaps that was also part of the plan, to inspire others. If his story helped someone else, then it was worth it. From then on, he received letters from people he had never met. Some were brief. "Thank you for not giving up." Others told stories of lives changed thanks to his gesture. Luis kept them all in a metal box, which he called the Box of Miracles. On one of his trips, he came across a caravan of volunteers offering free medical care in isolated communities. He offered to transport supplies and medicines in his truck. For weeks, he became the bridge between forgotten villages and those who wanted to help. He learned to organize routes, unloaded boxes with his own hands, and met doctors, nurses, and young people with an infectious passion. One night, around a campfire, a doctor told him, "You don't just drive, you connect souls." That phrase stuck with him, because yes, that was what he felt, that his mission was no longer just to reach a destination, but to connect the dots, to bring together those who felt alone, to be the invisible thread between pain and hope. And every time he started the engine, he knew he wasn't alone. That first passenger was still there, silent, guiding his every decision. There were times when Luis thought about retiring. He was already over 60, his body craved rest, and his hands trembled in the mornings. But every time he tried to stray from the road, something called him back, a message, an encounter, an unfinished story. Once, while filling up at a gas station in southern Coahuila, a young woman approached him with a worn Bible. "This was my father's," she said. "You helped him 20 years ago. He never forgot." Luis opened the book, and on the first page was written, "To Luis, the man who reminded me that God hadn't forgotten me." He fell silent, his throat tight, and hugged the girl as if she were his own daughter. At that moment, he knew he didn't need to travel any further roads to leave his mark. He had already left her. She was alive in others. That same day, he decided something important. He would return to his hometown, where he hadn't set foot in decades, not because he was tired, but because he felt he had closure. His childhood home was still standing, though old and empty. His mother had died years ago, his brother gone without a trace. He walked through the rooms in silence, touching the walls as if he could speak to the memories. He found a box of photos, a letter from his mother he'd never read, and an old rosary with worn beads. He sat on the floor, surrounded by dust and memories, and realized that his story hadn't begun on the road. It had begun there, in that home where he learned to pray in silence, to observe without being seen, to carry what others couldn't. The longest journey, he thought, always begins with wounds that take years to understand. During his stay in the village, Luis began walking every day along the dirt streets where he had played as a child. The older neighbors still vaguely remembered him as Doña Carmen's son. Some offered him coffee, others hugged him as if he had just returned from the war. Luis didn't recount everything he had experienced. He just smiled and listened. In a small church downtown, he sat several times in the back without saying who he was. One day, the priest recognized him. He had been one of the children he had helped years before when his mother carried him in her arms seeking refuge. "You took me all the way to Saltillo," he said with tears in his eyes. Luis looked at him in surprise, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that his life was a circle beginning to close. The seeds he had left, some without knowing it, had blossomed even without his presence. He returned to his truck with a changed peace. That night, before going to sleep, he wrote a short sentence in his notebook. "I've returned home, but I'm not finishing. I'm starting differently." The next morning, he felt renewed strength. He decided that as long as he had breath, he would keep driving, even if it was only short routes, even if it was just to listen. He began giving impromptu talks at gas stations, sharing his story with other young truckers, and telling them that not everything on the road was lonely. Some looked at him with admiration, others with skepticism, but everyone listened. Luis didn't speak from ego. He spoke from experience, from tears and miracles. His every word was an invitation to look beyond the asphalt, to understand that faith is not for those who preach from pulpits, but also for those who travel with open eyes and a willing heart. One morning, while resting at a gas station in Hidalgo, a young man approached him with a notebook full of drawings. "Are you Luis, the one with the red truck?" he asked timidly. Luis nodded with a smile. The boy opened the notebook and showed him a series of illustrations. Scenes on the highway, a truck with a cross on the front, people being helped, a figure of Jesus sitting in the passenger seat. "My father used to talk to me about you," he explained. "He died 2 years ago, but he said you saved his soul." Luis felt his breath catch in his throat. The young man handed him the notebook. "I want you to have it. It's my way of thanking you for something I didn't even experience, but that changed my life." Luis hugged him wordlessly. He treasured that notebook. It was proof that goodness multiplies, even when it's no longer seen. If you've made it this far, don't leave without subscribing. Every click you make is a way of saying, "I want more of this in the world." Moved by that gesture, Luis decided to compile all his notes, letters, drawings, and memories. Not to publish them, but to leave them as a legacy. He bought a large hardcover notebook and began writing from the beginning. The early morning on Highway 57, the man with the sandals, the chapel, the encounters, the daily miracles. Each word was a piece of his soul. He didn't seek fame or recognition, but he knew that one day someone would read those pages and understand that love doesn't always come wrapped in grandiloquence. Sometimes it comes in the form of an old truck, a kind gesture, a shared silence. That notebook was his new logbook, but also his written prayer. In it, there were no theories or sermons, only truth, only path, only lived faith. And every time he wrote a new page, he felt his mission lived on, mile by mile. One night, while driving along a lonely stretch between Durango and Torreon, Luis felt a stabbing pain in his chest. It wasn't the first time, but this one had something different about it. He slowed down, took a deep breath, and pulled into an empty rest area. He turned off the engine and stood there, silent, with his hand over his heart. The sky was full of stars, and for a moment, he thought maybe it was his time. He felt no fear, no sadness, only profound gratitude. He opened his notebook and wrote a few last words. If this is the last stop, thank you. Thank you for everything. The most beautiful journey was the one I took inside myself. He closed his eyes and let the silence envelope him. He didn't know how much time passed. When he opened them again, the pain had subsided and a strange peace surrounded him. He started the engine with a serene smile and moved on, like someone who has made peace with everything. That experience led him to prepare for the inevitable. He spoke with a pastor, friend, leaving instructions on what to do with his notebook, his carved crosses, and the box of letters. Everything was to be given to whoever needed it, regardless of whether they believed or not. He also wrote a final, brief letter, which he left in the glove compartment of the truck. It read, "I wasn't perfect, I was stubborn, sometimes blind, other times harsh. But one day I took Jesus with me in my truck, and from then on, everything changed." If you're reading this, maybe it's your time to change too. It wasn't about saying goodbye, but about continuing through others. Luis wasn't afraid to leave. He was afraid that no one else would dare to stop. That's why every word he left was a seed, and every person who met him a new path to blaze. Over time, testimonies began to emerge from other drivers who claimed to have seen Luis in unlikely places. Some swore they saw him in Baja California and, at the same time, in Chiapas. Others said his truck would appear just when they needed him most. A flat tire in the night, a sick child without help, a woman crying alone on the side of the road. Always the same red truck, always with a cross hanging from the rear-view mirror. When they looked for him later, there was no trace, only a note, a wooden cross, or a look that was never forgotten remained. That fueled the stories. Some began to call him the angel of the asphalt. Luis knew nothing of this. He just followed his route, each time slower, shorter, but just as steadfast. He knew it wasn't him doing the work. He was simply responding to the call, like that first day on Highway 57. A young journalist, intrigued by the legends, decided to track down his story. He traveled for weeks, interviewing people, collecting testimonies, cross-referencing information. Finally, he found him in a small inn in the north, eating sweet bread with coffee. Luis welcomed him naturally. He offered him a seat, listened patiently, and said, "If you're going to tell my story, also tell the stories of those who helped me continue." The journalist was surprised. He had expected to find an extraordinary man, perhaps a mystic, and instead found someone humble, down to earth, and with a humane outlook. They talked for hours. Luis didn't try to impress. He simply shared what he had experienced, what he felt, what he had learned. As he said goodbye, he gave him a cross and said, "Remember, every story you touch also touches you." Years later, that journalist wrote a book that changed many lives, but he always maintained that the true author was someone else. Luis never sought to be a legend, but unwittingly, he became one. New truckers mentioned him in their talks as an inspiration. Some hung crosses similar to his on their rearview mirrors. Others began to stop more often, carry extra water bottles, and look more closely at the side of the road. It wasn't a fad. It was a silent transformation. Luis had lit a light that others now carried, like torches multiplying in the darkness, and although his face aged and his body cried out for longer breaks, his soul remained alight. Every time someone asked him why he did what he did, he simply replied, "Because one day someone stopped for me." That was all his explanation was. He needed no more. He knew that whoever listened would understand. On one of his last long trips, while crossing a mountainous region, he was caught in a fierce storm. The wind battered the truck, and visibility was almost zero. He stopped under a bridge, waiting for the worst to pass. There, he found a family sheltering in their broken-down car, shivering from the cold. Without hesitation, he opened the truck for them, covered them with blankets, and shared the little he had. They spent the night together talking about life, fear, and hope. The father, with a broken voice, said, "I don't know if you're real or a miracle, but thank you for showing up." Luis just smiled. The next morning, when the sun rose, he helped them start the car and accompanied them to a nearby repair shop. Before parting ways, his mother gave him a long, heartfelt hug, like someone embracing a lost sibling. Luis recorded that night in his notebook as the storm that brought shelter. As the months passed, Luis began to spend more time stopped than moving. His truck, although still functional, no longer had the same power, just like him. But each stop was now more profound, more meaningful. Instead of crossing the country, he stayed for several days in small towns, listening to stories, helping where he could, leaving words and crosses. In one of those towns near Oaxaca, a woman asked him to talk to her son, who was about to give up everything. Luis sat with the boy on a bench under a tree and simply listened. He didn't give advice, he didn't quote verses, he just told him his own story. In the end, the young man said, "I thought I was the only one who felt empty." Luis replied, "We all feel that way. The difference is what we do with that emptiness," and that was enough. The boy decided to stay. Luis understood that his role wasn't to change lives in a spectacular way. His role was to be there, to be a presence, to be a pause in the midst of chaos. Over time, some began to seek him out not only for help, but to express their gratitude. He received letters, drawings, dried flowers, and small figures carved by children who wanted to imitate his crosses. His truck became a kind of rolling altar filled with symbols and memories. Once a group of children painted a phrase on the back in white paint, "Thank you for stopping." Luis didn't erase it. He left it there like a signature of his journey, because he knew that beyond the miles, what he really left behind were pauses. Pauses that allowed people to breathe, to grieve, to heal. And that, in a world that runs without looking around, was more miraculous than anything else. One day, in a village lost in the hills, a boy approached him with a notebook. It had drawings of a red truck, a cross, and a man with a beard and a smile. "It's you," he said proudly. Luis bent down and asked him why he had drawn it. The boy replied, "Because my dad says you're like Jesus, but with a trailer." Luis let out an honest laugh, the most genuine in a long time. Not because he thought he was a saint, but because of the purity of a child's gaze. "No, son," he said, "I only had you ride in my car once. Since then, I try not to stray." The boy didn't fully understand, but he gave him the notebook anyway. That night, Luis wrote in his notebook, "Sometimes children see more clearly than wise men. Today, you reminded me who rides with me." And he slept with a soft smile, cuddled with that gift. If you feel this story touched you, don't let it pass you by. Subscribe. Don't let this light go out. Make it reach farther. At another stop, a group of young people waited to hear him speak. They had read about him on social media and wanted to meet the man in the red truck. Luis didn't feel comfortable at first. He wasn't a speaker, he wasn't a leader, but he sat on the ground under a shaded spot and began to tell his story as he always did, without embellishment, without exaggeration, just the truth. He told them about fear, about tiredness, about the first time he felt he couldn't go on. And then he told them about the man in sandals, about the chapel, about the notebook, about each person who had unwittingly saved him. When he finished, One of the young people said to him, "I thought faith was a church thing, but now I understand it can also come in the form of wheels." Luis gave him a cross and said, "Faith is when you decide to keep going, even if you can't see the map." Luis began to notice that his body was giving him clearer signals. He had trouble getting up in the morning, and sometimes he was short of breath. Still, he didn't complain. He had learned to read the warnings with humility. Instead of forcing himself, he simply paused more. One afternoon, during a long pause, he wrote in his notebook, "My heart beats slower, but it still has direction." He spoke less and less, but he listened more. Some mistook his silence for weakness, but those who stopped by his side knew it was quite the opposite. His silence was full of meaning. He was like a deep river that no longer needed to run fast to remain a river, and in that slow flow, he continued to touch souls. Although he no longer traveled the miles he used to, his truck remained. A refuge, a shadow and company for anyone who needed it. On one of his last long trips, he decided to visit his mother's grave. He hadn't been there in years. Upon arriving, he placed a hand-carved cross next to the headstone and remained silent for a long time. He didn't cry. He just thought about everything he had experienced, everything he had been, and how somehow she had always been present along his path. "Thank you for teaching me to look at the sky, even when we were on the ground," he murmured. As he left, he felt a profound relief, as if another page had been tenderly folded. That night he wrote, "I forgave things I never knew I carried," because he understood that part of his healing also came from closing the cycles with love. His journey wasn't only toward others, it was above all a constant return to himself. As time passed, some people began sending him letters with no exact address, just a sender. Luis, from the red truck. Strangely, many arrived. The owners of gas stations, inns, and small churches knew who to look for when they saw that name. The letters came from all over the country. Testimonies, thanks, stories of lives that had intersected directly or indirectly with his own. Luis read them all calmly, responded to some, and simply stored others in his box of miracles. It was as if the words found their way on their own, just as he had done so many years before. He was surprised to read stories from people he had never met, but who claimed to have changed after hearing their story told by others. Kindness, he thought, has that gift. It spreads without asking permission. One rainy night, while he was resting at a nearly empty station, a man with a tired look and soaked clothes approached him. He didn't say his name, just asked to stay on the truck for a while to dry off. Luis offered him hot coffee, covered him with a blanket, and they sat in silence. The man finally spoke. "I was about to do something stupid tonight, but I saw you, and something told me to stop." Luis didn't ask any more questions. He just placed a wooden cross in his hand and said, "Stopping is also moving forward." The man burst into tears. When he calmed down, he thanked them, got off the truck, and disappeared into the night. Luis stared out the window, his heart heavy, knowing that sometimes you don't need to understand, just be there. And that, perhaps, that was his greatest miracle, appearing just when someone was about to give up. At another stop, an elderly woman approached him with a cane and a notebook in her hands. She told him that years before, her son had died in a traffic accident. For a long time, she hated everything related to roads, trucks, and those who traveled. But one day, someone told her about Luis and his story. "I don't know how to explain it, but since then, I began to heal." She handed him the notebook, filled with letters she had never sent, written to her deceased son. Luis received it respectfully, without opening it at the time. Later, alone, he read them one by one. Each word was imbued with pain, but also with contained love. That night he wrote, "Pain transforms, but love is what saves." And he understood that his mission was not only to relieve, but also to receive, to embrace what others could not hold alone. In the following days, Luis began visiting fewer towns, not because he didn't want to, but because his body was starting to give out. He slept more, drove less, Sometimes he stayed in the same place for weeks, parked next to a church, a school, a park. Still, people kept coming. He didn't need to move. His story had already begun to travel on its own. Some found him through intuition, others through referrals, others simply by chance. Each new encounter was greeted with the same tenderness as always. Luis was no longer surprised. He just smiled, offered a coffee, listened, handed a cross. It didn't matter if they were believers or not, if they were broken or just lost. He said the same thing to all of them. You are not alone, even if you don't see any company. And he embraced them all with that peace that only those who have made peace with themselves have. Luis began leaving small handwritten messages in the places where he spent the most time, on park benches, on the walls of diners, in rural libraries, at gas stations. Phrases like, God also walks with you. Love is not measured by distance. A pause can save you. He didn't sign any of them. He knew those words would find someone who needed them. Some people began collecting them. Others shared them on social media without knowing who the author was. Luis never sought recognition, but seeing how his words flew aimlessly and touched so many made him smile inside. It was like throwing seeds into the wind, and he fully trusted that the wind knew what it was doing. One day, when he woke up, he felt something different. It wasn't pain nor tiredness. It was as if everything in his body and soul was telling him, it's okay to stop. Not with sadness, but with acceptance. He stayed inside the truck all day, looking out the window, watching life calmly pass by. He wrote one last long entry in his notebook, remembering each stage of his journey. The encounters, the tears, the silences, the voices, the smiles. And at the end of that entry, he wrote in capital letters, "Thank you." That night, he wrote no more. He felt no fear. He just closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let sleep envelop him. They found him at dawn, asleep in his truck with an expression of absolute peace, surrounded by sunflowers that someone had left by the door. There was no merchandise, only a note on the dashboard, written in his own handwriting. The greatest journey I ever made was not on wheels, but inside me. The news of his passing spread quickly, not as a lament, but as a silent celebration. Truckers across the country shared stories about him on radio stations, on social media, in late-night chats. Under the open sky, wooden crosses began to appear on many routes, nailed to the side of the road, with phrases like, "Thank you, Luis," or "Keep leading from above." Some painted their trucks with red accents. Others began to stop more frequently, to look to the sides, to offer a cup of coffee or a prayer. The seed had germinated. What he had started no longer depended on his presence. It was a silent movement, a network of awakened souls in the middle of the asphalt. At a church in a small town, where he used to stop, a plaque was placed next to the entrance. Here prayed a man who carried God in his truck. It didn't mention his last name or his full story, but those who read it felt something special. At restaurants and workshops, his face appeared in photos alongside phrases he frequently repeated. "You are not alone. Faith also rolls. Listening is a form of love." His notebook was published by the journalist who had met him years before, respecting every word, without altering a single line. The book became a guide for many, not as dogma, but as a mirror. Because what Luis left behind weren't instructions but paths. Paths open to whoever dared to look with different eyes. And on each of those paths, on each one he decided to stop on, there was a little piece of him. Years later, many young people who had never met him in person began to follow his example. They formed groups that traveled the roads, delivering aid, listening to stories, and sharing words of encouragement. They didn't wear uniforms or carry fancy names. They had only one motto: stop if someone needs you. Some drove pickup trucks, others motorcycles, and others simply walked with backpacks filled with faith. All carried a small wooden cross in their pockets. And although not everyone knew exactly where this custom came from, they felt they were part of something bigger. They said that sometimes, in the middle of an empty road, they felt a red truck drive past them and honk its horn as a greeting. No one could prove it, but no one doubted it either. On Highway 57, right on the stretch where Luis found the Sandal Man, someone had placed a simple wooden sign with no sponsors or advertising, "Kilometer of Faith." Here began a journey without a map. It didn't appear on their GPS, but drivers recognized it. It was a point of pause, of silence, where many would get out of the truck, take a deep breath, and remember that there was still room for the sacred, even amidst the engines and dust. Some knelt, others left behind only a cross or a stone. No one said much there. There was no need to. The place had become a sanctuary, not because anyone declared it so, but because many souls had felt it that way. And every time the wind blew through the trees, it seemed like a soft voice whispered, "You are not lost. You are just coming home." The journalist who had written about him continued to receive letters, even years after the book's publication. Some came from other countries, from people who had read the translated story and felt that Luis spoke directly to them. "I never rode in a truck, but I felt like I was traveling with him," wrote a woman from Argentina. A young man from Colombia said that thanks to that story, he decided to quit drugs and start helping others. In Spain, a group of drivers created a foundation to support homeless people, inspired by the man with the red truck. What had begun as a silent gesture on a Mexican highway had crossed borders, languages, and hearts. Luis never sought to be an example, but he became one precisely because of that, because he lived without intending to. In a final interview, the journalist said something that stuck with me. Luis didn't leave us a lesson. He left us a way of life. And that way was simple. Look at others. Stop. Listen. Share what you have, even if it's little. It was seeing Jesus in every broken person, in every aimless traveler, in every story that seemed to matter to no one. It was understanding that miracles don't always have lights or crowds. Sometimes they come in the form of a shared thermos of coffee, a dry blanket on a rainy night, a word spoken just in time. Luis understood this after carrying Jesus in the passenger seat, and since then, he never drove alone again. That's why, for many, his story didn't end. It lives on, rolling with every person who chooses to slow down, look to the side, and reach out. In some rural schools, teachers began reading excerpts from his notebook to their students, not as part of the official curriculum, but as stories to begin the day. The children listened silently, fascinated by this man who was neither a hero nor a saint, but who transformed lives with small gestures. Some drew red trucks, others wrote their own stories of hope. On more than one occasion, events were organized in honor of Luis, where no money or mass assistance was requested, just a random act of kindness. Today, do what Luis would do, the signs. Read, and that day, people came out to give bread, hugs, and companionship. The story had transcended the man. It had become a cultural seed, a symbol, something children could understand without anyone fully explaining it to them. At a diner in the south, where Luis used to stop for lunch, a woman hung a cross on the wall with his name on it, and below it, a small plaque that read, "Here ate someone who knew how to feed with words." Over time, the wall was filled with notes, drawings, and thank yous. Customers left messages there for others, as if the place had inherited his spirit. Some said that, at night, they felt a different kind of peace when they sat at that table. Others simply smiled when they saw it. The owner of the place would say proudly, "He didn't just bless my food, he blessed my life." And perhaps that was the best way to sum up his legacy. Luis didn't change the world with grand gestures. He did it in his own way, gentle, firm, constant, like someone who travels for miles without leaving a mark on the asphalt, but in the hearts of those who saw him pass by. A young writer, inspired by his story, began visiting bus terminals and gas stations to collect stories from lonely travelers. Her goal wasn't to publish a book, but to listen. She said it was her way of following the journey Luis began. Over time, she collected hundreds of testimonies, which she kept in boxes labeled with names, dates, and places. In each one, she found an echo of the original. A message: we all have something broken, we all carry something, and we can all be a bridge for others. In her talks, she would say, "I don't know if Luis was real or a legend, but he made me step outside myself to look at others." And as she said this, often someone in the audience would stand up to tell their own story of encounter, of unexpected help, of a cross found at just the right moment. Because Luis's story was no longer just theirs, it was collective, in a documentary produced years later. It compiled road footage, interviews with people who knew him, and readings from his original notebook. There were no actors or special effects, just roads, faces, silence, hugs. At the end of the documentary, his truck was shown, still preserved by a small community that decided not to sell or move it. They kept it clean, filled with flowers and letters, as if hoping he would one day take the wheel again. The camera lingered on the note he left before leaving. "The greatest journey I ever made wasn't on wheels, but inside me." And in that moment, the image merged with the empty road, the sound of the wind, and a final sentence projected on the screen. "If you ever feel like you're alone on the road, remember, someone else has been there before and left a light." Over time, many people began writing letters addressed to Luis, even though they knew he was no longer with them. They didn't do so expecting a reply, but as an exercise of faith, gratitude, and healing. Some were read aloud in community groups, others were deposited in symbolic mailboxes placed at roadside stops. There was something powerful about speaking to someone who had made silence his language. In those letters, fears, mistakes, hopes, and promises to follow his example were confessed. On more than one occasion, someone said, "I never knew you, but you changed my life." And that was enough for Luis's memory to continue beating, not in statues or monuments, but in the intimacy of sincere words. It was an invisible, profound dialogue that didn't need to be alive to continue transforming. In various churches, regardless of denomination, they began to use his story as an example in sermons about service, humility, and compassion. They didn't canonize him, they didn't venerate him, they simply recounted his journey as that of an ordinary person who chose to do good without expecting anything. Pastors, priests, and community leaders read excerpts from his notebook, and the faithful listened with shining eyes. Because amidst so many speeches, Luis's life was a true testimony. And the most incredible thing was that his miracle hadn't consisted of healing the sick or multiplying bread. His miracle was to stop, to listen, to give time, attention, and comfort, to make the invisible visible. And that, many said, was the closest thing to the divine they had ever known. Years later, at a conference on community leadership, someone asked the speaker, "Who was the most inspiring leader you ever knew?" The man didn't hesitate. A truck driver named Luis, who led not with speeches or titles, but with pauses. The audience fell silent, because those words not only honored Luis, but also challenged the idea of greatness. Luis hadn't sought followers. He had followed his own calling, one born from pain, endured silence, and flourished in service. His leadership was simple, human, and transparent. And for that reason, it was unforgettable. That speaker concluded his talk by saying, "May we never lack the courage to stop, even when everyone else continues on." Today, his story continues to cross paths. There are children born long after his departure who bear his name. There are foundations inspired by his example. There are drivers who hang carved crosses on their trucks without knowing who was the first to do so. But deep down, it doesn't matter, because what was important wasn't him. It was what he sowed, the pause, the gesture, the listening. In a world that accelerates, without looking around, Luis Montalvo was the one who stopped, the one who saw, the one who loved without making a sound. His name no longer needs to be remembered for his legacy to continue, because every time someone offers help without expecting anything in return, Luis reappears in the world's rearview mirror. And so, the man who one day picked up Jesus in his truck became a path himself, not because of the miles traveled, but because of the lives touched. His story needs no end, because he continues traveling as he did, with faith, with simplicity, and with a cross hanging from his mirror. He finished his journey, yes, but his light, it still guides many who, like him, one day decided to stop. This story doesn't end here. If you made it to the end, prove it was worth it. Subscribe, share, and leave your mark. This channel continues thanks to you.